Hello, my name is Vanessa. I never thought I would be standing here holding memories and grief that no one should ever carry alone. 2 months ago, I buried my son, just me alone in the quiet of the cemetery while the sky wept with me. I wanted to scream, to call out to anyone, but I couldn't. The world had turned cruel in the blink of an eye, and my family, the people I thought I could count on, were somewhere else, laughing, celebrating, living their lives as if nothing had happened. I remember coming back from the cemetery that day, exhausted, my arms still trembling from holding the tiny coffin. The house was alive with noise, music, chatter, clinking glasses. My family had thrown a party right while I had just lost the most precious part of my life. I froze at the door, the smell of perfume and wine mixing with the echoes of laughter. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it would collapse. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me, and there it was, a message I couldn't believe. The words stared back at me. Check the 600K trust fund. It's all yours now. My hands shook so badly, I had to sit down on the staircase. My mind raced. Was this real? Was someone trying to console me, or was this some cruel joke? I opened my email, and my heart nearly stopped. There it was, the legal document, untouched. A mountain of money my son had left behind. A trust fund I had no idea existed. The irony hit me like a thunderbolt. While they were laughing, while they were throwing their frivolous celebrations, life had quietly handed me a power they never imagined I could hold. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The grief, the anger, the humiliation I had felt at their cruelty all turned into a spark, a fire I couldn't ignore. I realized that the same people who had mocked me, ignored me, and treated my pain as an inconvenience would now see me in a new light. Not as the broken mother, the grieving widow, the silent shadow in the corner of their lives, but as someone they could never control, someone who held the key to their very survival, to the wealth they had always coveted without realizing who it belonged to. That night, I stayed awake staring at the documents. I traced the numbers with my finger, imagining the faces of those who had laughed while I cried, and I smiled. Not a gentle smile, but the kind that carries the weight of every betrayal, every heartbreak, every ounce of humiliation I had endured. I realized then that revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in silence, it grows in patience, and it strikes when no one expects it. And I made a decision that night. I would claim what was rightfully mine. I would show them that grief can be transformed into strength, that the person they had underestimated and humiliated was now in control. And most importantly, I would make sure that when they finally looked up, they would see the truth. Their cruelty had created the very force that would make them regret it all. The next morning, I woke up to silence in the house, the kind that makes every shadow feel like it's watching you. My family hadn't noticed me yet, still nursing hangovers from their party, still thinking life went on as usual. I moved carefully through the rooms, my hands trembling with a mix of grief and something darker, anticipation. I had the trust fund in my hands now, and with it, the means to make them see me differently. I poured myself a coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers like they were alive. My mind was spinning, not with anger, not yet, but with clarity. While I had been broken, alone, they had been careless. They had underestimated the depth of my pain, the quiet patience of someone who has nothing to lose. And that, I realized, was power. I remembered how my sister laughed when she saw me crying at the funeral arrangements.
How my father had barely looked up from his drink. How my husband's family had congratulated themselves for being so strong while I fell apart. Every smirk, every dismissive word, every eye roll flashed before me sharper than knives, and suddenly I didn't want comfort, I wanted justice. I called my lawyer, a calm, meticulous woman who had handled my late husband's affairs. I explained I wanted full control of the trust fund, not just for me, but as a way to ensure that those
who had mocked and abandoned me wouldn't benefit from what rightfully belonged to my son. She didn't question me. She simply said, "You know what you're doing, Vanessa. You're protecting yourself." And I realized she was right. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming dignity, about showing them that their cruelty had consequences. That afternoon, I went back to the house, sitting quietly in the living room while my family flitted around, oblivious. I watched my mother fuss over food, my sister check her reflection in the mirror, my father talking loudly on the phone, and I sat calm, almost serene. They didn't see the fire burning behind my eyes. They didn't see the plans forming in silence. Then a thought struck me. Why stop at dignity? Why not make them taste a fraction of the power they had taken from me, the helplessness they had forced upon me while I grieved my child alone? And so I began quietly, making calls, arranging transfers, setting up notifications. Every move was invisible, deliberate. Every step was calculated to ensure that when the first ripple hit, they wouldn't even know it came from me. By the end of the day, I smiled quietly to myself. They had spent hours celebrating while I mourned, thinking I was broken beyond repair. And now slowly I was beginning to bend the very world they had thought belonged to them. The first whisper of revenge had begun, quiet, invisible, and unstoppable. By the third day, I could feel the subtle shifts. My family was restless, though they didn't yet understand why. My mother kept checking her phone, biting her lip, frowning at messages I knew nothing about. My sister's laughter at breakfast was forced, jerky, like a balloon someone had pricked and was trying to keep from deflating. And my father, he just stared out the window, silent, pacing in long circles that made the floor creak, pretending to read a magazine, all the while savoring the tension I couldn't yet name. They thought life had gone back to normal. They thought I was still the grieving mother, fragile and broken, the one they could dismiss and ignore. But behind my calm exterior, I was plotting every move with patience, letting the full weight of their disregard sink into them before I struck. That evening, a notification arrived on my phone, a confirmation that the first transfer had been processed. The trust fund was now officially in my control. $600,000 that they had never imagined I would see, never imagined I could wield. I smiled but quietly because this was only the beginning. Later that night, I saw my sister scrolling through her social media, biting her nails, eyes wide. She had noticed subtle changes in her bank accounts. Small things at first, but enough to raise suspicion. My father, meanwhile, had made 3 trips to the trying to understand numbers that now didn't make sense. And my mother, she came to me, hesitating in the doorway, whispering, "Vanessa, what is happening?" I looked at her calmly, my hands folded, my voice soft but steady. "What's happening is the truth coming out. I'm finally in a position to protect myself, to honor our son. That's all." I didn't need to say more. The words were enough. My mother's eyes filled with tears, though whether they were pride or fear, I didn't know, and for the first time, I didn't care. That night, I lay in bed and imagined the first moments of panic that would hit them in the morning. I imagined the conversations that would begin in whispers, the frantic calls to banks and lawyers, the confusion on their faces as they realized the tables had turned. For years, they had laughed while I suffered. Now, every single one of them would feel the subtle bite of fear, the unease of not being in control. And I would watch silently as it settled in. And yet, even as the thrill of the first victory touched me, I knew the real test was still ahead. This was only the start. Controlling the trust fund was not the end, it was the seed. The real revenge would come when they understood that the same family who had humiliated me while I buried my son could never undermine me again. And so I waited, quiet, patient, knowing the moment of reckoning would arrive. By the 4th day, the first signs of panic began to surface. My sister came to me in the kitchen, pretending to look casual, but her hands were trembling. She tried to joke about dinner plans, about the errands she needed to run, but her voice cracked. "Mom keeps asking about the accounts," she said, eyes darting toward the living room. I just nodded, silently, letting her squirm under my quiet gaze. She didn't know I was already watching. She couldn't imagine. My father, usually so composed, spent hours staring at documents, muttering numbers under his breath. The house that had once echoed with laughter and the smug confidence of people who thought they had all the control was now quiet in a different way, tense, heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel the shift in the air, a change that no one could yet name, and it thrilled me. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the dining table, pretending to read a letter from the trust fund administrator. My heart pounded with anticipation, not just from the money, but from the way it would slowly dismantle the arrogance that had surrounded me for so long. They had all taken me for granted, dismissed my grief, mocked my pain, laughed at my loss, and now every little move I made, every small shift in control would make them question everything they thought they knew. That evening, my mother came to my... She looked tired, older, and I noticed a quiet fear in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Vanessa, are you sure you want to do this?" she asked softly, her voice almost breaking. I looked at her calmly, hands resting on my lap. "I have no choice," I said quietly. For years, they laughed while I cried. Now it's time they feel what it's like to be powerless. For a moment, for just a moment, they need to understand. As night fell, I watched my family from the corner of the living room. My sister was frantically typing on her laptop, trying to track transactions. My father had made 3 more phone calls that ended in frustration and silence. My mother sat quietly, a mix of worry and resignation on her face. And me, I stayed calm, almost serene. The fire inside me was steady, controlled, knowing the moment of true reckoning was approaching. It was then I realized the most beautiful part of it works quietly, invisibly, like shadows stretching across the walls. And when it finally strikes, the impact is absolute. I sat back and smiled to myself, feeling a strange combination of grief and satisfaction. They had thought they could mock me while I buried my son alone. They had thought I was powerless. They didn't know that patience, quiet planning, and a little knowledge could turn the tables completely. And soon they would understand in a way. The next morning, I woke to subtle chaos. My sister was already pacing in the living room, phone in hand, scrolling and muttering under her breath. My father stood by the window, staring blankly at nothing, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. My mother quietly sat at the kitchen table, her lips pressed together, her eyes darting nervously between the two of them. The house felt different, tense, fragile, like it could crack. I poured myself some tea and sat at the table pretending to read the newspaper. I could feel their panic growing, though they hadn't yet connected it to me. They thought the numbers were a mistake, a bank error, something fixable. They didn't know the power of patience or the quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. I remembered the laughter at the party, the way they had dismissed my grief By mid-morning, my sister approached me, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom keeps asking questions about the fund," she said, trying to sound casual. I looked up at her, calm, almost gentle. "Then answer them," I said quietly. Her face tightened, confusion and fear mingling in her expression. "Vanessa, it's not just a few dollars. It's 600,000, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, letting my calm sink in like a stone into water. She hadn't realized yet that I wasn't just aware I was in control. Later that day, I received a call from the lawyer confirming the first official transfers and the trust fund status. My fingers trembled slightly as I hung up, but it wasn't fear, it was satisfaction. Every dollar, every transaction, every subtle notification that landed in my family's accounts was a silent message. The world had shifted and they had no idea who had moved it. That evening, I watched my family over dinner. My father barely touched his food, his jaw tight, his eyes flitting nervously to the laptop my sister had brought to the table. My mother kept her head low, trying not to make eye contact with me, though I knew she was watching every movement. And my sister, she was twitchy, fidgeting with her fork, pretending to sip her water, knowing somewhere deep down that something was happening she couldn't control. And I stayed calm, serene almost. Like the eye of a storm, they had spent years mocking my pain, treating me like I didn't exist, laughing while I buried my son alone. Now the first taste of helplessness had begun to seep into them, and it was intoxicating. Not the kind of pleasure that comes from cruelty, but the quiet, deep satisfaction of knowing the world had finally shifted in my favor. I remembered my son as I watched them, and I whispered his name under my breath. This was for him, for the injustice of loss, for the humiliation I had endured, for the silent strength that had grown inside me while the world celebrated my absence. And I knew this was only the beginning. They had no idea what was coming. By the 6th day, the tension in the house was almost unbearable. Every glance, every step my family took felt hurried, forced, like they were walking on thin ice they didn't realize I had placed beneath them. My sister's whispers grew, trying to piece together what was happening with the trust fund. My father spent hours in his office, shuffling papers, clicking through bank accounts, his forehead creased with worry lines that hadn't been there before. Even my mother, usually composed, seemed smaller, somehow shrinking into her chair as if the weight of silence had begun to press her down. I observed them quietly, a cup of tea warming my hands as I let the atmosphere of... They didn't see me as the woman who could strike back with patience, calculation, and precision. They had laughed while I cried, celebrated while I mourned, dismissed me while I bore the unbearable, and now every small ripple of panic that touched them was the quiet taste of justice. That evening, I walked past my father's office, pretending to glance at my phone. I noticed him frantically dialing numbers, talking fast, almost pleading. It says the trust fund is fully under her control. Can that even be legal? His voice trembled. I smiled slightly, letting the sound of his desperation sink into the walls of the house. I didn't need to interfere. I didn't need to explain. The truth in all its quiet power was already working. My sister tried to corner me later in the hallway, pretending she just wanted a casual conversation. Her eyes flickered with fear. Vanessa, are you serious? Are you actually... I looked at her calmly, my voice soft, steady. I told you, I'm in control now, and I will make sure that what's mine, what belongs to my son, stays protected. She stepped back, as if I had drawn a line she didn't dare cross. By nightfall, I could feel the shift in energy inside the house. My father was restless, unable to sleep, pacing the floors in long circles. My mother had stopped asking questions aloud, her quiet fear more powerful than any words could be. And my sister, she had retreated to her room, phone in hand, watching every transaction, every movement, desperately trying to predict what I would do next. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with sorrow. Relief because I finally held the power that had been denied to me for so long. Sorrow because I remembered my son, the little life that had been taken too soon, and the grief that had forced me into this path of quiet, calculated vengeance. And yet I knew this was only the beginning. They hadn't even realized the storm was forming. I poured myself another cup of tea, sitting by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the floor. The night was quiet, but I felt the electricity of what was coming, the inevitable confrontation with the family who had underestimated me. The first moves had been made, and now the ripple would grow unstoppable until every one of them understood exactly who I had become. By the seventh day, the tension had grown into almost tangible. Every room in the house seemed charged with fear, every glance a silent accusation. My sister avoided my eyes completely, pretending to busy herself with chores, her hands trembling when she thought no one was looking. My father had stopped pacing. Instead, he sat in his study, head in his hands, muttering under his breath about numbers, accounts, and mistakes he couldn't fix. And my mother, she hovered near me quietly, a mix of worry and awe in her eyes. Sensing that the woman they had underestimated had finally taken her place in control. I watched them carefully, pretending to sort through paperwork at the kitchen table, all the while letting them crumble under the invisible weight of power I now held. They had laughed while I buried my son, celebrated life while I sat in mourning, dismissed my grief while I cried in silence, and now the smallest ripple from me was enough to make them question everything. That afternoon,
my sister came to me, voice low and shaking. Vanessa, something's not right. I checked the accounts again. It's like everything shifted overnight. How is this possible? I looked at her calmly, almost gently, letting my quiet control speak louder than words ever could. It's always been possible, I said. You just never thought it could happen to you. She stepped back, eyes wide, realizing that she no longer had the power she had taken for granted her whole life.
Later, I saw my father on the phone repeating the same frantic questions to someone I couldn't hear. His face was pale, the lines in his forehead deep, the calm, composed man I had grown up with replaced by someone who realized he had lost control. My mother sat quietly at the edge of the living room, her hands clasped, whispering a prayer under her breath. I could feel the fear settling into every corner of the house, like a shadow that had crept in unnoticed until it was too late. By evening, my sister was frantically pacing, my father had stopped speaking entirely, and my mother barely lifted her eyes from the table. And me, I stayed calm, serene even, because revenge isn't loud, it isn't sudden, it works quietly, invisibly, until the world tilts in ways the arrogant never imagine. They didn't see me coming, they never had, and I knew the best part was still ahead. The true reckoning wouldn't come from money alone. That was only the beginning. Soon, they would feel the full weight of underestimating me, of laughing while I suffered, of believing I was powerless. Every step, every whisper, every small ripple of fear would grow until they understood the truth. The woman they had humiliated while burying her son had become unstoppable. That night, I whispered my son's name into the darkness, letting the memory of him fuel the fire inside me. Every laugh they had thrown my way, every cruel word, every careless glance, all of it had led me to this moment, and soon they would learn exactly what it meant to be powerless, helpless, and under the control of someone they had once thought weak. By the 8th day, the cracks in my family's facade were starting to show. My sister hadn't slept properly in 2 nights. I saw the bags under her eyes, the way her fingers shook when she scrolled through her phone, desperately trying to track every subtle change I had set into motion. My father had stopped leaving his studies, spending hours staring at spreadsheets, muttering numbers that no longer made sense. Even my mother, the quiet peacekeeper, had begun to flinch at the slightest sound, her composure gone, replaced by a thin layer of unease. I stayed calm, sipping tea at the kitchen table, pretending to glance at the news while secretly observing every move they made. They thought life was moving on, that I was the grieving mother they had laughed at while I buried my son, had quietly grown into someone they could no longer control. Every panicked glance, every whispered conversation I overheard only fueled the quiet satisfaction inside me. That afternoon, my sister cornered me in the hallway, pretending she just wanted to talk. Her voice trembled, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Vanessa, the accounts, the trust fund, something's wrong. I don't understand." I looked at her calmly, my voice soft but unwavering. "There's nothing wrong. The only thing wrong was the way you all treated me, and now the balance has shifted." She stepped back, realization dawning in her eyes, and for the first time I saw fear mingle with regret. Later, I walked past my father's study and noticed him on the phone, speaking rapidly, almost pleading. "No, it can't be. She controls everything now, every account. That's impossible." I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The panic was his own doing, the inevitable consequence of years of dismissing my pain. I watched silently, savoring every second, knowing that the first tremors of fear were only the beginning. By nightfall, my mother had retreated to her room, whispering prayers that carried a mixture of hope and dread. My sister was still pacing, phone in hand, eyes wide with anxiety. My father sat frozen at the dining table, staring at a blank screen. And me? I remained calm, the eye of the storm, letting the subtle chaos grow around me without lifting a finger. I thought of my son, the little life I had buried alone, and let his memory strengthen the resolve inside me. Every laugh, every careless moment my family had spent celebrating while I grieved had not been forgotten. Every pang of humiliation I had endured became fuel for the quiet storm I had unleashed, and I knew deep inside that the moment soon, very soon, they would understand the price of underestimating me. And when they did, I would be there watching silently as they realized that the woman they had mocked while she buried her son was no longer powerless. She was unstoppable. By the 9th day, the tension had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. My family's carefully maintained confidence had begun to crumble, and I could see it in the smallest. My father's distracted, muttering, my mother's quiet glances that spoke volumes. Every subtle change I had initiated with the trust fund was now rippling through their lives like a hidden tremor, and the panic in their eyes thrilled me in a way I hadn't expected. That morning, my sister tried to confront me again. She came to the kitchen, hands gripping her phone tightly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound casual. "Vanessa, the transfers, and I can't explain it. It's like everything shifted overnight." I looked at her calmly, almost serene. "You'll understand soon enough," I said softly. "Maybe by the time you realize it'll be too late to fix." She froze, a flicker of fear flashing in her eyes, and I knew that subtle victory had already landed. Later, I noticed my father's unease growing even more pronounced. He was no longer pacing aimlessly. Instead, he sat at the desk, jaw clenched, phone pressed to his ear, repeating the same questions, hoping anyone could explain the inexplicable. He was flailing, grasping at numbers and legal documents, desperate to regain the control he had assumed he always had. And I watched silently, savoring every moment of his panic. By evening, my mother came to me quietly, standing in the doorway, her voice low and uncertain. "Vanessa, is this really necessary? Are you sure you want to go this far?" I looked at her, letting the weight of and the memory of my son strengthen my voice. "I have no choice," I said firmly. "They laughed while I buried him. They mocked my pain. Now they need to understand in every small way that I am no longer powerless." Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She understood even if she couldn't fully accept it. That night, I watched them over dinner, the unease thick in the air. My sister's fork hovered midair. My father's hand trembled as he held his glass, and my mother barely touched her plate. The quiet tension between us was almost unbearable, but it was mine to command. Every subtle reaction, every twitch of anxiety, every glance filled with worry confirmed the truth I had known all along. Patience and quiet strength were more powerful than anger or loud confrontation, and as I looked at their faces, I whispered my son's name in my mind. This was for him, for the life I had lost, for the humiliation I had, and for the silent strength that had grown inside me while the world celebrated my absence. The real reckoning had begun, and soon they would see just how far a mother's love and grief could go when fueled by justice. By the 10th day, the panic in the house had become undeniable. My sister's hand shook as she typed furiously on her laptop, trying to track the money she could no longer control. My father had stopped speaking altogether. Frantic tone. Even my mother, usually composed and serene, could barely meet my eyes, her quiet fear a sharp contrast to the confidence she had always exuded. I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a magazine, but every movement I made, every sip of my tea, felt like a calculated strike. They didn't see me coming. They had laughed while I buried my son, celebrated life while I grieved, dismissed my pain while I suffered, and every whisper of panic that passed between them was a reminder that I held the power. That afternoon, my sister came to me, voice quivering. "Vanessa, this is insane. The accounts, they're all moving. How is this happening?" I looked at her calmly, letting my eyes meet hers. "It's happening because you forgot one thing," I said softly. "I am not powerless, and I am not broken. Not anymore." She stepped back, realization dawning, fear mingling with. For the first time, she saw the woman she had mocked while I grieved as someone who could no longer be dismissed. Later, I watched my father on the phone, repeating the same frantic questions, trying desperately to regain control. "This isn't right. She can't have done this. Someone must have made a mistake." I smiled quietly, savoring the sound of his desperation. I didn't need to intervene. His panic was the natural consequence of years of believing that grief had made me weak, but weakness had never been the truth. By nightfall, the house was tense and silent. My mother whispered prayers under her breath, her hands clasped tightly, eyes wide with worry. My sister paced endlessly, phone in hand, checking and rechecking as if sheer repetition could reverse what had already shifted. And I remained calm, steady, almost serene, because revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it works quietly, invisibly, until the weight of inevitability crashes down. As I lay in bed that night, I thought of my son, the life I had lost, the grief I had endured alone. I whispered his name softly in the dark, letting the memory of him fuel my resolve. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice. This was about making the people who had mocked me while I suffered understand the power of patience, planning, and a mother's love that refuses to be broken. And I knew that the moment of full reckoning was coming soon, very soon. They would feel the true weight of underestimating me. And when they did, I would be there, watching silently, as the woman they thought powerless became the force they could never escape. By the 11th day, the first real consequences began to hit them. My sister's confidence had completely vanished. She flinched at every notification, her hands shaking as she scrolled through her. Every subtle change I had made to the accounts had become a ripple, turning into a wave she couldn't control. My father sat at the desk, staring blankly at the screen, muttering numbers that no longer added up, his mind unraveling faster than I could have imagined. My mother ever so quietly hovered near me, her usual poise replaced with a fear I had never seen before. I observed them with a calmness that belied the fire building inside me. They thought that I was still the grieving mother, fragile and broken, but I was no longer fragile. I was no longer the woman they had mocked while I buried my son. And every twitch of panic, every whispered conversation, every frantic glance in my direction reminded me that my quiet power had begun to take hold. That afternoon, my sister confronted me again, this time with tears streaming down her face. "Vanessa, you can't be serious. This Letting my calm voice carry all the weight of years of grief and humiliation. "You didn't think I could fight back when I had nothing left to lose, did you? You didn't think I'd rise from this pain. But here I am, and now you will understand." She stumbled back, the first real fear I had been waiting for reflected in her eyes. Later, I overheard my father talking to a family friend, panic sharp in his voice. "I don't understand. She controls everything now." I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The fear was his own doing, a natural consequence of years of dismissing my pain, ignoring my grief, and celebrating my absence. I smiled quietly to myself. The storm had begun, and it would only grow stronger. By nightfall, the house had fallen into a tense, unnatural quiet. My sister sat on her bed, phone in hand, eyes glazed with worry. The quiet voice of reason for so long remained silent, almost afraid to breathe. And I remained serene, sipping tea, letting the fear settle around me like a blanket. I thought of my son as I watched them crumble. Every laugh, every careless remark, every glance that had ignored my suffering, all of it fueled the quiet fire inside me. The first wave of consequences had arrived, and soon the real reckoning would be unavoidable. Painfully and slowly, the cost of underestimating a mother's grief and the quiet strength that comes with it. By the 12th day, the tension in the house was suffocating. My sister hadn't left her room in hours, phone clutched tightly in her hands, eyes red and wide with fear. Every notification made her jump, every unfamiliar number on the screen, a new panic. My father, who had once been so composed, now sat slumped in his chair, staring at the wall as if willing the problem to disappear. And my mother, she hovered silently, trembling slightly, her hands clasped as if holding herself together was an act of sheer will. I moved through the house like a shadow, observing, listening, letting every small reaction sink in. They had mocked me while I buried my son, laughed while I mourned alone, and dismissed my grief as weakness. But weakness had never been my truth. And now the first signs of my sister approached me again, barely able to speak. "Vanessa, this is too much. Please, you have to stop. It's not fair." I looked at her calmly, letting my eyes convey the years of silent pain she had caused me. "You think fairness matters anymore? Do you think they cared about fairness when I was grieving alone?" Her face paled as realization struck. She understood finally that this wasn't just about money. It was about power, about respect, and about the consequences of cruelty. Later, I overheard my father again, frantic, muttering to a lawyer over the phone. "I don't understand. How can she have this much control? There must be a mistake. Someone fix this." I smiled quietly, knowing that no one could fix what was already in motion. His panic was the natural result of years of underestimating me, ignoring my grief and believing I was powerless. By nightfall, the house was eerily quiet, my phone in her lap, eyes glassy. My father barely moved, lost in his own frantic thoughts, and my mother, she barely whispered a prayer, as if hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. And me, I stayed calm, serene even, because revenge doesn't need to be loud. It works quietly, invisibly, until the weight of inevitability crashes down. I thought of my son, of the life I had lost, and whispered his name under my breath. Every quiet tear had built this fire inside me. The first waves of fear had arrived, but the tide was just beginning. Soon they would feel the full force of the reckoning they had unknowingly invited. And when they did, I would be there, watching silently, as the family who had mocked me while I buried my son realized that the woman they thought powerless was unstoppable. By the 13th day, the fear in the house had become almost unbearable. Every hesitant, like walking on a floor they thought would support them, but had been silently weakened. My sister no longer tried to hide her panic. Her hands shook constantly, her eyes darting at every notification, every whisper of sound. My father had stopped trying to fix things, muttering only to himself, staring blankly at the computer screen, as if pleading with it to reverse what had already shifted. My mother, always composed, now hovered like a fragile as if the very air held the weight of what was happening. I watched them quietly, sipping my tea, letting their fear settle in around me. They had mocked me while I buried my son. They had celebrated while I grieved. They had dismissed my pain, convinced I was powerless. But now the power that had been denied to me for so long flowed through my hands, quiet and unstoppable. And every twitch of anxiety, every whispered conversation they tried to have without me, reminded me that my plan was working. That afternoon, my sister tried to confront me again, voice breaking. "Vanessa, this has gone too far. You can't do this to us." I looked at her calmly, letting the stillness in my voice carry all the weight of years of grief and humiliation. "Do you remember laughing while I buried my son?" I asked softly. She froze, the color draining from her face. "Do you remember mocking me while I cried alone? You called me weak, powerless."
Insignificant.
This is what happens when you underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose. Later, I overheard my father speaking frantically on the phone, desperation sharp in his voice. "No, it can't be legal. She controls everything now. We need to stop this." I didn't need to intervene. The panic was his own, the natural consequence of a lifetime of arrogance, dismissal, and cruelty. I simply sat back and watched, letting the they had invited was now inevitable. By nightfall, the house was silent, but the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating. My sister sat curled in her chair, phone in hand, eyes glassy, every notification making her jump. My father stared blankly at the wall, lost in his own anxiety. My mother whispered prayers under her breath, hands trembling, almost afraid to breathe. And me, I remained calm, serene, almost detached, because the storm I had set in, it was happening naturally, beautifully, terrifyingly. I whispered my son's name under my breath as I reflected on the days that had passed. Every pang of grief, every tear, every moment of humiliation had built this fire inside me. The first tremors of fear had arrived, but the full weight of justice was still to come. And when it finally struck, I knew they would understand in a way that would stay with them forever, that the woman they thought powerless was the one who had been quietly, unavoidably unstoppable. By the 14th day, the panic in the house had become unbearable. My sister hadn't slept in 2 nights, eyes bloodshot, her hands trembling as she scrolled through every account, as if the weight of the household had shifted and she could feel it crushing her. I moved through the house like a shadow, observing every twitch, every anxious glance, every whispered conversation that tried to escape my notice. They had mocked me, humiliated me, laughed while I buried my son, and dismissed my grief. And now each small ripple of fear that passed through them was a reminder that the quiet strength I had built inside myself was stronger than anything they had. That afternoon, my sister approached me, voice trembling, her eyes wide with panic. "Vanessa, you can't do this. Please stop this madness." I looked at her calmly, letting the full weight of my grief and patience settle into my gaze. "Stop? You think I would stop after years of being mocked, dismissed, and ignored? You thought I was weak, powerless, but I am not. And now," and I knew she had finally seen the truth. I was no longer the grieving mother. By the time the house fell silent, the full weight of my quiet revenge had begun to settle. My sister curled up in a chair, phone in hand, heart racing. My father stared into the darkness, muttering numbers that no longer mattered. My mother whispered prayers, hands trembling, afraid to speak. And I remained calm, serene, knowing the final moments were near, the moment when everything would come crashing down and they would truly understand the woman they had once humiliated. I whispered my son's name softly in the darkness, feeling the sorrow and the satisfaction intertwine. Every tear, every pang of grief, every humiliating laugh they had thrown my way while I mourned had led to this. The reckoning was almost complete. Soon, the family who had laughed while I buried my son would finally feel the full impact of underestimating me, the woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. By the 15th day, everything had changed. My family, once so confident, so arrogant, now moved like shadows, careful with every step, careful with every word. My sister barely left her room, phone clutched tightly, eyes wide and haunted. My father had stopped muttering numbers. Instead, he sat at his desk, head in his hands, finally realizing he had lost control. And my mother, she stayed quiet, whispering prayers under her breath, no longer asking questions, no longer pretending. I sat in the living room, watching them crumble crumble under the weight of their own arrogance, a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction settling in my chest. I had not sought revenge out of cruelty alone. It was justice, a reckoning for every laugh, every dismissive glance, every mocking word while I buried my son alone. And now they finally understood what it meant to underestimate someone they thought powerless. That night, I checked the message one last time, checked the 600K trust fund. I smiled quietly, the culmination of patience, grief, and planning reflected in those words. They would never forget the fear, the helplessness, the total loss of control. Every step I had taken, every subtle nudge had led to this moment, a perfect, quiet, unstoppable victory. As I looked at my family, I whispered my son's name, feeling both grief and closure. The storm had passed, the pain remained, but now it was intertwined with strength, resilience, and the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to rise, to take control, and to demand respect. If this story has touched you, if you felt the heartbreak, the betrayal, the intensity of revenge and justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for daily stories that explore the deepest human emotions. Share this story with your friends so they too can experience this journey and understand the power of patience, grief, and quiet strength. Every story here is a reflection of real emotions, a life lesson, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, we can find our own way to take back control. Thank you for watching, and remember, life may test you, but it can never break you if you hold your heart and your strength together.
Hello, my name is Alex, and this is the story of how my own brother tried to break me and how I made sure he paid the price. I always believed family was supposed to stand together. No matter how hard life hit, I thought my brother Ryan would have my back. We grew up under the same roof, sharing hand-me-down clothes, splitting peanut butter sandwiches, and surviving the same storms. But I learned the hard way that sometimes the people you trust most can be the first ones to bury you.